Before Frasier became one of the smartest sitcoms ever made, before the radio show, the opera tickets, the sherry, and that famous Seattle apartment, the cast of Frasier were living very different lives. One of them lost their original dream and had to start over from scratch. One of them grew up in the exact world their character would later work in. One of them was a theater actor who thought his career was over before it began. One of them didn't even start acting until he was 37 years old. And the man who would become Frasier Crane had already lived through more tragedy than most people experience in a lifetime. And when you know that, when you really know who these people were before Seattle, you start to realize something. The characters on Frasier don't feel real by accident. They feel real because, in some ways, these actors had already lived parts of those lives. And if you enjoy revisiting classic shows like Frasier, consider subscribing to Backtrack Television. We dive into the stories behind the shows you grew up watching, because the most surprising story of all belongs to the man who played Frasier himself. And the truth is, the most polished character on the show came from the most complicated life. But to understand how all of this came together, we have to go back, before the show. When Frasier premiered in 1993, it was already different from most sitcoms on television. It was a spin-off of Cheers, which almost never works. Spin-offs usually don't survive. But Frasier didn't just survive. It became one of the most successful and most awarded sitcoms of all time. The show followed Dr. Frasier Crane, a psychiatrist who moves from Boston to Seattle to start over. New job, new city, new life. Hosting a radio advice show while trying to rebuild relationships with his father, his brother, and the people around him. The show worked because of the relationships. Frasier and Niles, two brothers who were almost the same person and yet completely different. Martin, the blue-collar father who didn't understand his sons at all, but loved them anyway. Daphne, the outsider who slowly became the heart of the family. Roz, the friend and co-worker who kept Frasier grounded in reality. It was smart, but it was warm. Sophisticated, but relatable. And even now, decades later, people still watch it because the characters feel real. And maybe that's because the actors had already lived so much of this before the show even started. If you want to watch the full series, I put links in the description. Let's start with Jane Leeves. Long before she became Daphne Moon, the eccentric physical therapist from Manchester with the strange stories and the big heart, Jane Leeves thought her life was going in a completely different direction. She wasn't trying to be an actress. She was training to be a ballet dancer. This was serious training at the Bush Davies School of Dance in England. Ballet wasn't a hobby. It was her future, her identity, her plan. And then she injured her ankle. And just like that, the plan was gone. If you've ever worked towards something for years and then suddenly had to let it go, you know how disorienting that is. When the future you imagine disappears, you don't just lose a plan, you lose a version of yourself. So she pivoted, modeling, small entertainment jobs, anything that kept her performing. And then she did something that sounds exciting when you say it fast, but was probably terrifying when she actually did it. She moved to Los Angeles with about $1,000 and the phone number of a man she had met on a commercial shoot whose mother said she could rent her a room. That was the plan. $1,000, one phone number, one room. If you've ever moved somewhere new and told yourself, it'll work out, even though you had no idea if it would, you understand that moment in her life. And then came the years that almost every actor goes through, but nobody sees. Acting classes, small auditions, tiny roles, trying to get an agent, trying to get one job that leads to another job. In one of her acting classes were a group of other unknown actors, Jim Carrey, Ellen DeGeneres, Winona Ryder, Molly Ringwald, all in the same rooms, all trying to get their break at the exact same time. It took years before Jane Leeves started getting steady work. Small sitcom roles, recurring parts, shows that didn't last very long. Nothing huge. Until one role came along that would change everything. Years later, she would play an outsider starting a new life in someone else's home. She had already done that in real life. But as hard as her road was, it still wasn't the hardest story in this cast. Not even close. Peri Gilpin, Roz Doyle. Roz is the voice of reality on Frasier. While Frasier and Niles are debating wine and opera and which sauce reduction pairs best with duck, Roz is the one actually doing the work. Running the show, booking the guests, keeping the station alive. She works in radio. And what's fascinating is, Peri Gilpin grew up around radio her entire life. Her father was a major radio and television personality, a real broadcaster. the kind of voice people recognized instantly, the kind of person a whole city listened to every day. So years later, when she walked onto the set of Frasier and sat down in a radio booth wearing headphones, people who knew her father said it was surreal. It looked like she had stepped into the same world he had lived in. But her path into acting wasn't instant. She studied drama seriously. University training, theater training, even studying in London. She was doing it the long way, the hard way. And for a while, acting wasn't even paying the bills. She worked as a makeup artist, behind the scenes, which is actually how she met actress Blythe Danner, who encouraged her and helped open doors for her acting career. Not discovered overnight, not an instant star, just years of training, side jobs, and slowly getting closer to the door until finally someone opens it. And then she lands the role of Roz Doyle, a radio producer, the daughter of a real-life broadcaster, playing a radio insider on one of the biggest shows in America. Sometimes casting directors don't just find actors, they find people whose lives already feel like the character. Roz worked in radio. Peri Gilpin grew up around it. That's not a coincidence. Now David Hyde Pierce. Niles Crane might be one of the most perfectly cast characters in television history. Nervous, precise, elegant, quietly hilarious, and capable of incredible physical comedy. That physical comedy didn't come from nowhere. When David Hyde Pierce was a kid, he used to perform for his family every morning. He was the youngest of 4 children, and he figured out that if he wanted attention, he had to be entertaining. So he created a routine. Every morning, he would stand at the top of the stairs, pretend to get shot, and fall all the way down the staircase in a dramatic death scene. Every morning, different fall, different performance. Most actors learn physical comedy in acting school. David Hyde Pierce learned it by fake dying before breakfast. But his career wasn't sitcoms at first. It was theater, Yale, New York stage work, Broadway. And for a moment, it looked like everything was about to work out. He landed a role in a Broadway show, and during previews, audiences were laughing so hard it felt like a hit. And then the reviews came out. The show closed 2 weeks later. He sat on the stage after the final performance and cried, because when something you work for that long disappears that fast, it doesn't just feel like the show failed. It feels like you failed. But he told himself something that would carry him through the rest of his career. If failure feels this bad, then success must feel amazing. He just didn't know yet that success was waiting for him in a role that was originally supposed to be very small. And if you think that's a rough start to a career, wait until you hear what Kelsey Grammer went through before Frasier. And then there's John Mahoney, Martin Crane, the chair, the cane, the flannel shirts, the retired cop who somehow made sitting in a recliner one of the funniest performances on television. But John Mahoney didn't grow up in America. He was born in Manchester, England, and as a teenager he moved to the United States to live with his sister, who had married an American serviceman after World War II. And once he was in America, he made a decision that would change the entire course of his life. He joined the U.S. Army, partly to serve, but also because military service was one of the fastest ways to become an American citizen at the time. But the Army did something else for him too. It helped him reinvent himself. When he first joined, his Manchester accent made him stand out, and he didn't like the attention. He didn't want to be the English guy. He wanted to blend in. He wanted to be American. So he deliberately changed the way he spoke. He worked on his voice until the accent was gone. And that's why, years later, when millions of people watched Frasier, almost nobody knew that Martin Crane, the most American, blue-collar character on the show, was played by a man who had been born and raised in England. After the Army, he used the GI Bill to go to college. He became an English teacher, then an editor. He lived a normal life, a stable life, a safe life. And then, at 37 years old, he did something that most people only talk about. He started over. He quit his stable job, gave up the safe path, and decided to become an actor. No guarantees, no backup plan. Starting from zero at an age when most people are trying not to start over. And slowly, through theater, he became one of the most respected stage actors in the country. Not famous, respected. And that life experience is probably why Martin Crane never felt like a sitcom character. He felt like a real person, because John Mahoney had already lived an entire life before he ever walked onto that set. But even starting over at 37 isn't the most unbelievable part of this story. That belongs to Kelsey Grammer. Kelsey Grammer's story before Frasier is almost hard to believe. Frasier Crane is one of the most confident characters in television history. He walks into a room like he belongs there. He speaks with authority. He gives advice for a living. He always sounds like he has the answer. But the man playing him had lived a very different life before Frasier ever started. When Kelsey Grammer was 13 years old, his father was living and working in the U.S. Virgin Islands as a restaurant owner. During a period of unrest and rioting, his father was shot and killed outside his home. Just a few years later, when Grammer was 20 years old, his younger sister Karen, who was 18, was kidnapped outside the restaurant where she worked in Colorado. The men who took her had originally planned to rob the restaurant, but when that didn't work, they took her instead. She was later murdered, and Grammer was the one who had to identify her. He would later say that this was the moment that changed his life forever. And then, not many years after that, his two half-brothers died in a scuba diving accident. By the time Kelsey Grammer was in his mid-20s, he had lost his grandfather, who helped raise him, his father, his sister, and his two half-brothers. That is an almost unimaginable amount of loss for one person to carry, especially at such a young age. And for a while, he didn't handle it well. He has spoken openly about struggling with alcohol and drugs during his early career, and there were years where his career was unstable, where his personal life was unstable, and where it looked like his life could go in a very different direction. But he kept acting. He kept working, he kept moving forward, and eventually, he was cast in a role on a sitcom called Cheers. He was only supposed to appear in a few episodes. The character was meant to be temporary, but audiences loved Frasier Crane, and the character stayed. And then something very rare happened, a spin-off. And not just any spin-off, one that became one of the most successful sitcoms of all time. And over time, something else happened too. He began to talk publicly about grief, about forgiveness, about the idea that if you hold on to anger forever, it destroys you more than it destroys the person you're angry at. He became involved in victims' rights advocacy, and he has spoken about trying to find forgiveness and peace after what happened to his family. Not because what happened was okay, but because he realized that if he didn't find a way to move forward, the tragedy would define his entire life. Frasier Crane spent 11 years telling people how to live better lives, and the man playing him had spent years just trying to survive his own. And that changes the way you see Frasier Crane a little bit. Because Frasier isn't just a man who gives advice. He's a man who believes people can change. He's a man who believes people can be forgiven. He's a man who believes you can rebuild your life after you make mistakes. He's a man who believes you can start over. And when you know Kelsey Grammer's story, those themes don't feel like sitcom writing anymore. They feel personal. So, Daphne was the outsider from England, and so was Jane Leeves. Roz lived in radio, and so did Peri Gilpin's family. Niles was a theater-minded perfectionist, just like David Hyde Pierce. Martin was the working-class realist, just like John Mahoney had been for most of his life. And Frasier was a man trying to build a perfect life while carrying a lot of pain. And Kelsey Grammer understood that part better than anyone. And maybe that's why, when you watch Frasier, it never really feels like a show about radio or psychiatry or fancy apartments. It feels like a show about family, about second chances, about starting over, and about trying to build a life that makes sense. Before Seattle, before the radio show, before the sherry and the opera, they were just people trying to build their lives. And in a strange way, that's what Frasier was about the whole time. But this wasn't the only cast whose story took a surprising turn. Some of the biggest shows of the 90s had behind-the-scenes moments that completely changed their legacy. And one of them is even more shocking than this. If you think this story was unexpected, wait until you see what happened next. Click the video on your screen now. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to like the video. It really helps the channel. Subscribe to Backtrack Television for more stories behind the shows you grew up with. And in the comments, tell me, who was your favorite character on Frasier?